Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the online version of Café Scientifique. If for some reason you can't hear us that well, please post something in the chat box and I'll address that concern. As you know, a lot of you know, my name is Olaf Krigolson. I'm an Associate Director of the Center for Biomedical Research at the University of Victoria. And this is the online version of Café Scientifique. Tonight, we have an excellent talk coming from a close friend of mine, Dr. Kent Hecker. Dr. Hecker is a professor of health professions education and veterinary medicine with a joint appointment in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. In terms of research, Kent studies performance in health professions education. Specifically, has built a program of applied and basic research focusing in three areas: selection of applicants, assessment of student trainee competency development across the healthcare continuum, and the application of neuroimaging methods, so taking pictures of the brain, to assess learning, reasoning, and decision making. Dr. Hecker is an inaugural University of Calgary teaching scholar, the chair of the Medical Education Specialization Graduate Program, and the chair of the Veterinary Education Research Group. He has over 65 peer-reviewed publications, over 100 conference abstracts, and 33 invited presentations at national and international meetings. Dr. Hecker has run national and international workshops on educational research design, instruction methods, assessment methods, and learning. And that's the formal introduction. The informal introduction is that I have known Dr. Hecker since I was 4 years old and he was 5, as our parents used to play tennis together back in Salmon Arm, BC, where we both grew up. And the funny anecdote I'll leave you with is a couple of years ago, I was a professor at Dalhousie before I came to UVic. And one day I got this email because I'd lost touch of Kent when we were undergrads. He was at Lethbridge and I was at UVic. And I got this email saying, "Are you the Olaf Krigolson from Salmon Arm? And are you this guy doing neuroscience and decision making?" To which I said, "Yes, Kent, it's me." And we ended up reconnecting as friends. And now we've got a couple of exciting collaborations on the go. And we've already finished a couple of exciting collaborations. So when we were planning the online series, I thought that Dr. Hecker would be an excellent speaker for you on an exciting and interesting topic, especially with COVID going on as it is. On that note, what I'm going to do is mute my microphone, keep an eye on the chat box for you if you've got questions. Just a reminder of the format: Dr. Hecker is going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll field questions. The easiest way to do that is to type a question in the chat box, and Dr. Hecker will repeat the question and answer the question for you at the end of his talk. We won't take questions during his talk, however, so Kent, feel free to not look at the chat box until you're done your presentation. So without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Kent Hecker to Café Scientifique. Away you go.
Thanks, Olaf. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm actually sitting here in Calgary right now, looking outside at the rain. It's the trees are just starting to bloom. I wish I were in Victoria, where I'm sure you're a couple of months ahead of us in terms of spring. As Olaf mentioned, he and I, even after that lengthy introduction, which is quite daunting to hear yourself being introduced as such, Olaf and I have had, as a result of reconnecting, a long and fruitful collaboration, I would argue. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is well, the title that was sent out was Exploring Decision Makings in Health Professions. What I'm going to be talking a little bit about is the cautionary tale of the seduction and futility or utility of neuroimaging in health professions education. And I'm going to try to provide context associated with how ideas and research have been explored in terms of decision making in health professions education, in order to give a bit of a background. Then, and how I'm going to manage this talk is not necessarily provide answers, but more discuss the journey that I've gone on and really expose some of the areas of interest that I have, but also some of the things that you will soon start to see are that keep me up at night when we're trying to do this work as we bridge and move forward at the intersection of a multiple different disciplines. So I'm hoping that the next slide would appear, but it doesn't look like it. Just a second, please. Let's see if this works. There we go. I'm hoping everybody can see that. So there is a disclaimer. Having been in academia for a while, and I'll give you a bit more of a context in just a bit, I'm not afraid to pick up bones of contention and to argue them and banter them back and forth. I've also not been afraid to be called a bit of a fool sometimes, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. What I try to do is address questions, ask what I think are of interest to me, of interest to the people that I work with, to people that I collaborate with, within the context that I do research. And so some of the topics we may be discussing that I may be presenting may have a little bit of an edge to them. They may be a bit of a bone of contention, but you'll also see some of the perspectives that I've had that I've started to develop as I progress through this career of mine. So a little bit about my story, just to flesh out what Olaf's talked about, just so that you have an understanding of the context given the talk. And also, everybody's used to nonverbals. Unfortunately, I don't have nonverbals, so it will be interesting to get feedback at the end to see how well this talk has gone on. And in order to ensure that there's a level of understanding and either increasing or decreasing the quality of the talk as well as the pitch and time of the talk. So my story is that I've actually got a PhD in medical education research. There's a program at the University of Calgary that's here, and I've gone through the graduate program here that really focuses on the application of different disciplines in medical education to ask and answer various questions. And I focus specifically on psychometrics, and psychometrics really is the science of learning using quantitative methods. I like data, I like numbers, I like modeling along the way. But I didn't start off necessarily at the University of Calgary as a graduate student. I actually started off as an administrator, and I helped create different undergraduate and graduate programs. One was the Bachelor of Health Sciences program, and one was the Doctor of Veterinary Medicine program. So yes, Calgary does have a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine program. We've had it since about 2008. And I've been fortunate enough to help with the creation of the admissions process, but also of the curriculum. And fortunately, have been able to be hired on as a professor in order to study whether or not some suggestions that I made at the very beginning actually affect how we select people, how we train people, how we get them to a point where they are deemed competent to go out to practice. And that's what I'll be talking about in terms of health professions education. It's a combination of both in medical education, veterinary medicine, as well as a number of other health profession related disciplines. My passion, as I mentioned, is a measurement and learning and working with intelligent people. And I really do believe it's team-based science. And so you can see that there's a number of collaborators, both within the University of Calgary, as well as across Canada, and some that I haven't listed that are also international in nature. So what is this medical education research, if you haven't actually come across it? I would argue that it's a field, it's not a discipline, not like neurosciences, not like engineering, not like epidemiology. It's an applied field of study intersecting different aspects of different disciplines, one being higher education, cognitive psychology specifically, multiple social sciences. In my case, I'm interested in the intersection of psychometrics as it's applied to higher education to determine how best we measure these and determine performance. And so what we're really interested in determining is studying and learning in decision making within the trajectory of a health professions program. How do you take an individual? How do you actually select for them, put them through a program, and at the end of all of this, really determine whether or not they're competent to go out to independent practice? How best do we see this? And I would argue that the fundamental component of a health professions education program is to really train individuals based upon foundational knowledge pieces in order to have an understanding of decision-making purposes in order for the health benefit of our animal and human population, especially as what we're going through right now. And this is really, really testing our resources and our decision-making process as we move forward. As a result of the trajectory of learning, I'm now the director of the Health Education Neuroassessment Laboratory, which Olaf mentioned is a collaborative space in order to take a look at the intersection of learning, decision-making, and neuroassessment and neuroimaging along the way. So Olaf mentioned to me is, well, why are we studying learning and decision-making in health professions education? And I think we have to take a look at the trajectory of not only the graduate, but also take a look at some of the information that's actually out there in terms of background information that's there. So this is from about 2015, 2017, based upon a number of different reports that came out about preventable injuries and adverse events. There's about, in Canada, 170,000 patients a year experience preventable injuries. As many as 23,000 die due to what's called adverse events, and one could argue that the primary, one of the primary components associated with experiencing either preventable injuries or sadly adverse events that do result in death are potentially these decision-making components that we'll be discussing and that we'll be exploring with you along the way. I'm going to give you some background associated with what that looks like in terms of the trajectory of some of the decision-making literature that's going to be there, and then build it within some of the ideas that both Olaf and I have in terms of the use of neuroimaging, rightly or wrongly, in order to move those ideas forward. And as you can see in discussions with individuals here at Calgary, I know that it costs about $60,000 for educating a medical student in Alberta per year, and it's fairly consistent across other health professions in Alberta, as well as medical students across Canada itself. So the outline for the talk is to frame the discussion. So what are we actually looking at? What are the components associated with it? I'm really interested in discussing the journey and really challenging and maybe not having a number of answers, but really hopefully outlining some of the areas to really think about in terms of the decision-making literature and in terms of some of the research that has gone on to inform our understanding of how individuals within the health professions actually make decisions or come to the decisions that they come to. We're going to be talking about a little bit in terms of neuroeducation. You may have already heard this from Olaf. We'll put it in the context of what I'm familiar with and the background that I have. I'm going to give you an indication of what keeps me up at night and the perspectives that I have building forward and how that actually relates to the research that we've been doing and where the research is going in terms of the lab that I have, and really talk about can neuroimaging inform education and decision making. I think we have to think about this quite thoroughly. Individuals have written about it for at least a few decades, and we really have to see whether or not some of the work that we've been doing can indeed inform how we train individuals, but also how we train people to make decisions along the way. And I think another question is, should we actually use neuroimaging to inform education and decision making? So really taking a look at some of the different questions that arise as a result of doing the studies that we're doing in the context that we're performing those pieces. And then we'll follow it up with what now keeps me up at night as we move through. So even as far back as 1978, one of the preliminary studies, compilation of studies, I would argue, is by Elstein, 1978, which looked at medical problem solving. A fascinating read if you have the opportunity to take a look at it. And even back then, the statement was, until we are effectively able to understand neurocognitive processes underlying decision making, these early researchers in clinical reasoning remain correct in that we will not be able to dependably teach or evaluate one of the most important characteristics. So even 34 years up until the next statement in 2012 that Kurzweil made, there was this idea, this recognition that everything that we're doing are proxy pieces of information associated with learning and decision making in the health professions. There is a vast amount of literature that is there, really interesting work, some of what I'll share with you in just a little bit. But the underlying component has always been we're making assumptions of what is going on within people's brains based upon some of the behavioral research that we've been doing, and strong behavioral research that we've been doing. Kurzweil is in 2012, 34 years later, followed that up and basically said the closer we can get to being able to precisely understand the brain of decision making, the more we'll be able to tailor in this area of clinical education and affect clinical diagnosticians. Maybe a lofty goal, maybe I think maybe a better way of putting it is there has to be a lot of foundational work in order to achieve some of the comments that Kurzweil has made along the way. So, some questions to guide our presentations and to talk about decision making within the health professions education. Can imaging methods differentiate analytical and non-analytical decision making processes? And we'll talk a little bit about what analytical and non-analytical means. Individuals here might have read Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and we'll refer to that and some of the statements that are there, and then build some studies and take a look at that. Can imaging methods assess learning better than the assessment methods that we currently have? And this is what I currently study as a measurement person. I am continually asked to say, do we trust the assessments that we've made of our trainees so that we think that they are competent in order to move to the next level? What are those assessment methods that should be used, could be used, and how best do we build those pieces up and move forward with those? Can neuroimaging result directly translate to better education? These are questions that people do have. There's some ideas associated with that, from whether or not there's a direct translation, whether or not we can ethically do this, whether or not we actually use these pieces of information in order to advance theory within this topic in this area. In terms of decision making, this is a broad topic. Please understand that there are decades worth of research that has been done in a number of different areas. People have made careers, multiple people around the world have made careers out of exploring decision making, not only within the health professions, obviously, but outside the health professions. But within the health professions specifically, it has had a very storied and fascinating history. Began right around Elstein and some others that have started to develop and take a look at approaches used in clinical reasoning and tried to really discern, are there general problem-solving skills that should be looked at, that could be looked at, that could be used within curricula. It then morphed into this idea of not only approaches to clinical reasoning, as I mentioned before, analytical versus non-analytical as an example, but also start to think about, well, how does knowledge play into this? How do knowledge structures play into this? And how is memory used when evaluating a clinical problem? And what are those components that are actually brought to bear and used? And more importantly, is there a difference along the way between novices and experts in order to determine, can we use this novice-expert differences in order to move the students, trainees, along that trajectory? We can also talk about the neuroimaging and neurosciences as it applies to decision-making process as a next step of what had gone on previously. And we started to see a number of studies go on from the 2000s, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and how best that actually has structured with some of the studies that we've done, Olaf and I have done, but some studies that other people have done as well, and then some of the questions that have arisen as a result. So as you're probably familiar with, System 1 versus System 2, thinking fast and slow, this is the idea that there is a continuum, if you will, with System 1 versus System 2, non-analytical versus analytical, where System 1 is fast, it's pattern recognition, it could potentially be emotional. System 2 is where it's very much, it's slower, it's deliberate, it's resource intensive. People are sitting there thinking about components in order to make appropriate decisions as they move forward. Others that have picked up on this idea, books that you may have read, are Blank by Malcolm Gladwell. There is How Doctors Think is another book that has come out as a result of the studies that have been performed looking at these pieces. And it's really interesting actually to take a look at some of the conclusions that are actually talked about and made as a result of this. And then this is setting us up for this statement that comes across a number of times. The slower, more deliberate, more reflective, and more careful we are, the fewer mistakes will be made, which really suggests that we should be defaulting ourselves into a system 2 type of mentality when we come across, in this case, a clinical situation or a clinical presentation with a patient, being animal or human, and really think through appropriate and make deliberate calculations as to what we're trying to accomplish in order to make a diagnosis. And it's really interesting that they would come up and say that intuition, if you will, for system 1 versus rational and deliberate is error prone, whereas system 2 is error free. And is that actually the case? And people are actually interested in taking a look at the similarities and differences between those two and really starting to study, is that actually the case through the lens of clinical reasoning and decision making? And really try to tease apart, if there is a difference, if one is error prone and one is error free, can we then develop and teach towards either one or the other in order to best affect people's learning and decision making as they move through their learning trajectory within a health professions program? Now, interestingly enough, and I don't necessarily have a slide for it, but if we think about expertise, well, what is expertise? Well, expertise, if we think about those individuals, it's usually fast, quick decision makings that for the most part are more accurate in terms of time. So there is decreased amount of time and increased amount of accuracy with those that we inherently think are experts outside of the field of medicine, as well as inside the field of medicine itself. But really, this last statement is where a number of individuals have really started to go after and look at it, not through a neuroeducation lens or neuroimaging lens, but through a cognitive psychology lens, and ask some really interesting questions. So, can we determine if intuition, this idea of system 1, is error prone in health professions decision making? And the idea that this group had was, and there's a series of authors associated with it, but there's this end of studies that we'll just take a look at really quickly. If it is, the faster people go, the more mistakes they'll make, which makes intuitive sense. If it isn't, the faster people go, the more likely they're able to be right. And so this group does actually state and talk about Kahneman's work and some others' work in terms of system 1, system 2, and the tension that's potentially there. And they're really interested within the clinical realm is what is the relationship between response time and diagnostic accuracy. If we give pieces of information to people, can we actually determine, is there a relationship with time and accuracy in order to really start to delve into this idea of system 1 versus system 2? So study 1, and this is Sherbino from 2012, and the participants are residents. And residents, as many of you will know, are individuals who have graduated from medical school or in a particular discipline in order to get and receive further training so that they can eventually become independent practitioners. Individuals that go through medical school cannot go out and hang a shingle and become an independent practitioner. It's individuals that move through and go through residency and then have an understanding that of a specific topic area that they can then go and practice. So the question that they asked, or the situation that they put them in, is that they said, you're going to be in a busy emergency room. There's a bunch of people that are around. You're going to have very, very limited time. So what they wanted people to do was to look at 25 different clinical cases with a clock on them and have them actually respond with a clinical diagnosis. And in some cases, they were harder than some of the other ones as well. These cases included both a description of a patient and some kind of a lab associated with it, as well as the participants recorded their experience or their understanding or level of expertise of each of the questions that were asked. There were 25 cases. There were 75 residents that did this first study. Interestingly enough, the accuracy rate was 45%. And there were really two hypotheses that this group was actually testing. The first was if candidates use rapid processes, this idea of system 1 versus system 2, we should see a negative relationship between reaction time, RT, and accuracy. So decreased time would give you increased accuracy. And interestingly, the correlation between reaction time and accuracy is a value of negative 0.54. So decreased time, increased accuracy. Now, correlation, as many of you may or may not know, goes from -1, an inverse relationship, to a positive relationship all the way to 1. And so negative 0.54 is something that these authors, Sherbino et al., gave an indication for that idea that decreased time and increased accuracy, which was really interesting. And for all 25 cases, there was that negative relationship. The second hypothesis that they wanted to determine was the relationship between what people self-disclose in terms of their experiences, as well as their accuracy as well. So what they tried to do was, and again, they correlated between experience and accuracy, and what they found was it holds true for 19 out of 25 cases, which is interesting in and of itself, that with these more novice individuals, when you rush them through, there seems to be a relationship between decreased time and increased accuracy, which really kind of goes against the statement that people should be slower, more reflective, and pondering of decisions before they actually come to a conclusion, in this case, a diagnosis. So you may say, well, Kent, well, that's one study, but what happens when you tell people to take their time? So this group thought of that. They then did the exact same study design, 25 cases, my apologies, with a population that was the same, residents using the exact same material. The only thing that they changed was the instructions. You may spend as much time as you wish reading cases, information, so ensure that you've considered all the data. In this case, what was interesting is, if you remember back, the accuracy was approximately 45% for the previous study. This one was 47%, so not a huge increase with the same population using the same content. But what they found was that telling people to go slow just made them slower, not more accurate, and same pattern of speed and accuracy appears to be there with this group of individuals that they were taking a look at. But then you might ask, well, what about the experts? Well, could we take a look at similarities and differences between novices and experts, or at least two levels of experts, given that we already have these different groups that have gone through the experiments? And so what they did was they compared and contrasted residents and staff, individuals with expertise, and residents that were just going through the process. They asked them again to go fast and to go slow as they go through. And what you see in terms of the residents, similar to the previous two, is that the average accuracy is about the same. The average time is typically about the same within study design, so 58 seconds when they went fast, 79 seconds when they went slow. In the staff, what they found was the average accuracy, thankfully, increased. But they also found that it really was, again, telling people to go slow, to try to default them into type 2 reasoning or system 2 type of reasoning. Again, just made them slower, not more accurate, and the same pattern of speed and accuracy is going to be there. So the conclusion, the implications suggest that evident non-analytical or intuitive reasoning occurs, and that it's quite accurate, interestingly enough, which goes against some of the comments that were made before in terms of slowing down and being more deliberate. The relationship between speed and accuracy appears to hold even when participants are encouraged to slow down a little bit. And this group that has been quite active, and they're actually out of McMaster, and the individuals who have done the studies have now moved into a number of different positions across Canada and still do lead some of this research, really question some of the assumptions about what we should be doing when engaged in a diagnosis and suggest a rethinking of what might lead to errors. But that has led me to ask, and these individuals who I've been in contact with, to ask, well, what really is going on? We're making decisions of different processes that are going on in order to make decisions. And are these processes the same or different within inside the brain? Are there different memory structures that are accessed as we start to take a look at differences between novices and experts? And so what's happened is that this field of neuroeducation, which really started in kindergarten to grade 12, with some of the work that's been done on by an individual by the name of Daniel Ansari from back east, is to start to take a look at, can we actually bridge that gap and really take a look at how does the brain interact, if we can do that, with ideas associated with education and psychology. And we're really at that nexus of those three different disciplines in trying to take a look at mind, brain, and education science. And ultimately, what we want to do is to use performance data, this behavioral data, and neural data to improve our understanding and optimizing learning environments and educational methods. And that's some of the areas that I've started to step into, and we'll talk a little bit about how I've started to shift my focus of research into that area as well. So how do we do this? You've been exposed to or talks, is my understanding, through Olaf, that have taken a look at different neuroimaging methods. Typical types of methods include the fMRI top left corner, where people lie on their back. It's a big magnet that goes around and around their head. It's noisy if you've ever been in there. You're asked to read a screen, and then you're typically asked to lay back and then to answer using a keypad per se. And what we're looking at is the bold response in the brain in terms of blood oxygenation and deoxygenation as a measure of what's and where parts of brain activity actually occur. To the right, what you see is an EEG. That's what Olaf is famous for, and that's the stuff that he's and I have been leveraging off of as well. You can start to see the electrodes that are on the individual that are there, record electrical activity as they go through various experimental paradigms. If you go straight down to the Muse, you can actually get a portable EEG, which is what Olaf talked about last week, and taking a look at the application in it more in an in situ environment, which is something that we're really interested in as well, and taking a look at the use of portable technologies within different classrooms, as well as different simulated settings in health professions education. To the left is something that we have as well is eye tracking. So we have combined eye tracking with EEG in order to take a look at not only the electrical activity, but trying to take a look at the relationship between where people look, what people are looking at, and the length and time that people are actually looking at something as they go through various paradigms that we've created along the way. And so these are just a few. There are others that people do use, but these are the ones that have been typically shown. And so one of the projects in terms of health professions education is to take a look and track the number of different studies that have actually gone on using health professions education students as individuals who are participants in these studies of learning, reasoning, decision making, and even emotions along the way. And you can see that I found one way back in 1946, between 1946 and 1953, that used EEG to take a look at emotions as a result of a lecture, that one was. But you're starting to see an increase in the number and types of studies that are started to be looked at, explored. It's not just decision making, it's associated also with visual and object recognition. It's associated with surgical skills and psychomotor skills associated with it, and really trying to tie those components, the behavioral, the psychomotor, as well as the neural pieces together in order to get, one would argue, a clear picture of learning and decision making within the health professions along the way. And so this is a piece that Olaf's a part of, and we're doing what's called a scoping review in order to articulate and outline who's doing what type of research where, and to see the quality and the veracity of the studies that are actually out there. So we'll descend into the abyss just a little bit and give you an indication. Again, this is a journey for me. I would argue that I'm an applied neuroscientist at best, and that's why we have teams of us around and individuals that we collaborate and work with. My background really is educational measurement and assessment, so it's an understanding of how best to design these experiments to build a better appreciation and understanding of what people are learning and doing and deciding. So what kept me up and what moved me in this direction is measurement and error. So I'm a statistician by training. I'm interested in whether or not we can actually model data properly. And what has occurred over time is that given the messiness of these types of data that we get in terms of understanding how best to build questions, how best to assess competencies within and across individuals and over time, there's always measurement error, and that keeps me up at night and trying to account for that properly. And then also trying to identify what conclusions can be drawn when we can only account for a certain percentage of the variance within our models. Are there other pieces of information that we can use in order to have a more and more robust understanding of how people learn, how people make decisions within the context of health professions using various methods? And so that really did, and it is a concern of mine, not only as a person doing research, but also as editors of a journal, taking a look at what conclusions can be drawn and how best can we generalize our information if we're only accounting for 4 to 6% of the variance. What I'm passionate about are assessment methods, and are we actually capturing the underlying neurocognitive processes associated with those components? And some of the studies that we'll be doing, not talking about necessarily today, but looking at these different types of assessment methods and determining which part of the brains actually light up as a result of having and being asked a similar content from different perspectives to determine whether or not think we're targeting the most appropriate areas in terms of the brain based upon the literature that is currently out there. And for me, the conversations that we had when I first got into this field, way back when as a graduate student with my supervisor, is can we actually measure a more proximal functional variable? And so we talked about the use and the utility of potentially neuroimaging within the types of studies that we've been performing. And we never thought they would actually come to fruition, but we're actually going to review a few of how we take a look at different types of clinical reasoning, decision-making, and learning in the health professions. So as a result of those, I've gotten into neuroimaging, have teamed up with people like Olaf, clinicians to provide context, cognitive psychologists along the way in order to start to build a repository of individuals who can come together in order to address these pieces. And what I've begun to realize, have an appreciation for, is that we're juxtaposing a number of disparate literatures. There's the clinical reasoning literatures that are out there. We talked a little bit about, or I presented a little bit about System 1 versus System 2. There's a number of other different reasoning literatures that are out there, and we really have to take a look and be cognizant of those theories and what lenses by which to look at clinical reasoning. There's different ideas and different knowledge associated with an understanding of knowledge structures and theories of memory within health professions education and outside of health professions education. And sometimes I would argue that we don't necessarily do a good job in understanding how best to translate other people's disciplines into the field of neuroimaging or into the fields of health profession education. And then finally, the imaging literature and its concerns with theories and experimental designs. And so what I'll talk about is the struggle by which to look at these theories in their respective areas and how best to interpret information that's now starting to be reported, but it really depends upon the lens by which you look through. So further into the rabbit hole, here's a tale of two studies. One we ran at our institution, University of Calgary, with a graduate student, Pam Herska, master's student. Olaf was part of this as well. Another study that came out of a group from the United States took a look at really starting to tease apart this idea of analytical versus non-analytical reasoning and take a look at the neural basis associated with it. Our study, we were interested in taking a look and have multiple reports so far on taking a look at novice expert differences along the way. And so Steve Durning is well known within the medical education sphere. I would love to say that Olav and I are, but we're becoming more so as we move through. So what do these studies do? So in the studies that were reported by Pam, that's Hershka et al., as well as Steve Durning, that's Durning et al. 2015. These were preliminary novice expert studies where we had first-year medical students and we had practicing gastroenterologists, so experts in the field. And during study, they had medical interns, so those that are just moving into residency, as well as having expert internists within their study that they looked at. We used fMRI, so the big magnet that you saw a couple of slides ago, where people lied back. They spent about an hour with us, where they would lie back, put in earplugs. They would take a look at and answer questions. I'll go through the experimental design in just a second. And what we asked them to do was to answer 16 multiple choice questions and diagnose a clinical presentation. 8 of them were deemed as hard and 8 were deemed as easy. Within Durning's study, they had 32 multiple choice questions. They didn't necessarily differentiate them into hard and easy. They were just more interested in the speed and accuracy by which they took a look at those clinical cases, made decisions, and how they diagnosed. In our study, we took a look on the left-hand side. An individual would read. They would then click through. They could then answer. The most likely diagnosis is. They would respond using a keypad, A, B, C, or D. They would provide a level of confidence. How confident were you in your decision-making process? And then we'd actually provide them feedback in terms of their answers that they provided. In Durning's study, they were looking at read was the same, answer was the same, and then they tried to, which was interesting, instead of asking about confidence or providing feedback, they had them then think about how they actually reasoned through the question in order to come up with the answer that they did. In our study, again, this goes back to this idea of system 1 versus system 2, if you will. We had originally thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we can tease apart system 1 versus system 2? And had multiple discussions, debates, arguments as to whether or not we could do that given the type of study that we ran. Our feeling was, given the competitive nature of experts versus novices, as well as putting them into an environment that is not where they make decisions, we felt that we defaulted everybody into a system 2 type of reasoning and decision-making process. In Durning's study, they were actually interested in non-analytical, and what they thought was non-analytical in terms of system 1 reasoning was taking a look at and comparing those images during their answering time period as well as their reflection time period, and taking a look at those contrasts in terms of brain activity associated with it. And interestingly with us, what we found, especially with our hemispheric differences paper, was experts and novices, we felt, use different decision-making systems for complex problems. So not all 16, but only for 8 of them. The more difficult the question, it seemed to trigger a different decision-making system for complex problems within system 2. And I got a slide that shows those differences next. In terms of Durning's work, what they found, or what they reported, was experts manifested greater neural processing efficiency in regions such as the prefrontal cortex during non-analytical reasoning. So they felt that they had identified a neural processing mechanism in order to that was associated with non-analytical system one decision-making topics along the way. So while some of the experimental designs were the same, some of the processes were identical, the analysis and then the subsequent interpretation are somewhat different in terms of what we did. So in our study, what we found was that there were novice expert differences in hemispheres. The blue is novices, the red are experts, and what we found was that as people, we found hemispheric differences in that left-hand side, the side that's on the right, blue is novices. We found that there were differences in hemisphere activation between the two, employing two different decision-making processes. The first using a semantic factual knowledge rule-based strategy guided by basic causal explanations, which are novices because they don't have experiences as of yet. Whereas the experts, interestingly enough, on the right side, were more based upon experiences and exemplars, and that's the part of the brain that lit up within them. We took a look at those pieces of information, which was really interesting. So they defaulted more to what experiences did they have when they were answering those types of questions, those more difficult types of questions, where the novices were going back to basic rules as well as semantic factual knowledge pieces, which is really interesting. And interestingly enough, we were excited about this, and when I showed this to another neuroscientist colleague of mine, she kind of laughed and went, well, yeah, of course, that's been shown in other disciplines. And so the question really is, though, is that so what? What's next? And so it's interesting that, oh, my apologies. It's interesting that even though we tried to be careful in terms of reporting that we were defaulted people in system 2, that we were interested in saying that there were differences in these complex cases, other people had picked up the work that we have done and basically stated that if system 1 and system 2 can be distinguished among experts at the level of brain functioning, and they cited our studies, then we should be able to demonstrate this as well as medical students trained in fast diagnosis. And that's not what we did. And so it's interesting to see how well it's been picked up, and it worries me somewhat that it has been picked up from that perspective. And the interesting really piece is, and building off of the ideas associated with it, is given what During had reported, given what others had talked about in terms of, yes, there is a difference between system 1 versus system 2. During says they've found a neural component associated with system 1. It really begs the question, is expertise optimization or reorganization? So are expert clinicians, do they have different functioning brains, or is it reorganization? So optimization versus reorganization. And funnily enough, the difficulty is, given the studies, it depends. If you take individuals in training studies and you train individuals over time, and this is not within the health professions education, and I'd love to be able to take a look at this kind of a study. What has been reported is that it can result in both a reduction and increase in activation of the same neural areas. Whereas if we do novice expert studies, much like what we're talking about here, it seems that experts recruit additional neural areas when solving domain-specific tasks. And this led to an idea of a two-stage of development of expertise, and something that I'll just touch on in just a second. And I see what we found were, my apologies, and you guys get to see me and I don't get to see you. What we found were that as learners become experts, new knowledge structures emerge to support functional reorganization. So that led us to actually reanalyze the data that we have. And what we were interested in is Are there within and between group activities where participants are not engaged in clinical reasoning tasks, resting state? And is there speed accuracy trade-off, and how is that related to brain activity? So interestingly enough, this has not been published yet. We're working on it. It is a result of, I think, being in the current pandemic that we're in. So this is hot off the press, actually, in terms of identifying and taking a look at brain activity. And this is based upon resting state. So we actually had individuals lie back, lie down, and just look at a fixation cross both before the tasks we asked them to do, read and respond to multiple choice questions, as well as after the task. And at the time, Phil Cortese, who is an individual who is looking at these data right now, said it would be really interested to see if we can tie together what is going on during resting state, during that time when they're prepping to answer questions, as well as their performance and accuracy, and then whether or not there's the same state at the end. And to cut to the chase, it was really interesting in that experts had the same type of connectivity pattern, both pre and post, and novices did not. So experts really showed that there was right frontal pole connectivity between dorsolateral and medial prefrontal regions at the front of the brain. And it was the same during pre and post task. In novices, it was not. So how did that look in terms of a speed accuracy trade-off? To take a look at this, expert on the left, novices on the right, what we have is relationship in terms of functional connectivity, what's called the SEED, accuracy, that's performance, time, positive is above, and negative is down below. And what we found was a similar pattern in experts. So we found that increased connectivity in this network was associated with greater diagnostic accuracy and decreased speed for decision making. And it was same versus pre and post. We didn't identify that within the novices, which gives us an indication that there potentially are different neural, first of all, potentially functional reorganization could potentially occur, that the experts had functional activity pre and post task, and these were associated with executive control and decision making. There are different neural networks that support decreased time and increased accuracy in experts compared to novices. And this really gives another indication as to the functional reorganization for clinical reasoning. Now, the interesting piece is giving a lecture online where you can't see anybody. There, you have other pieces going off. So Olaf said, keep an eye on time. And Olaf, how much time do I have? If that's okay, because I can.
About 2 minutes.
Perfect. You know what? Then what I'll do is I'll show a quick picture of my lab, which I really, really miss, on a study that we took a look at learning using EEG. And that in the mirror or in the middle is Dr. Sarah Anderson, and the person who has the headgear on is Bethan Wilson. And what we took a look at is neuroanatomical learning. And we actually identified a way of quantifying learning based upon Olaf Krugolson's work as it applies to learning neuroanatomical structures. Given that I have 2 minutes, I'm going to talk just briefly about challenges about this. So Olaf, I'll be done in a minute 30. The first piece that you have to think about as you look at these pieces of information, it's great that we have pictures of brains and it looks like we're actually measuring neural activity, but are we forcing participants to act in artificial ways in these environments? And are the levels of complexity the same in these environments? And that's something that has been questioned and really challenging for a number of us who do work in this field. We also have to be wary of what's called a reductive bias. Learning expertise decision-making is reduced to electrical activity and blood flow. And that really, is that appropriate given the work that we're doing? And a number of people have written about whether or not we can reduce this information to neuroscientific evidence when we're talking about expert performance in real-world activities and practices. Implications for education. A lot of people expect that neurosciences will directly affect what is going to happen within a classroom. And Ansari has written extensively on this and really talks about we need to have a gradual understanding of the translation of this information into actual practice within education, both health professions and K-12. We're interested in the correlate and causality. A critical goal for educational neurosciences to specify causal development mechanisms of learning. That is a lofty goal, I would argue. We really are trying to figure out the experimental methods and paradigms that are required in order to have a better appreciation of what this information is telling us as it applies to health professions education. Ethical and philosophical challenges. Specifically, I like actually, so I did pop over and take a look at the question. I did like the question. Almost there, the ethical and philosophical challenges. The way in which evidence is communicated becomes critical ethical issues for mind-brain science, particularly those who are generating neuroscientific evidence. And we really have to be cognizant of what we're doing and how we're doing and how we're portraying the information as we're moving forward. So, in conclusion, in terms of decision making, in terms of using neuroimaging, what now keeps me up at night are lofty conclusions that are made based upon the research that has been performed. The other piece that is worrisome is a lack of expertise, not of the clinician themselves, but as individuals coming into this field. They're at a confluence of multiple different disciplines, and so we rely on team-based science. And so I am always asking questions of Olav, of other neuroscientists, of the clinicians, of other psychologists in terms of what is the appropriate theory, what is the appropriate experimental paradigm, are we doing these analyses properly, can we actually move forward in terms of the implication in terms of education. I worry about the translation piece. And finally, to get back to the other comment that I made in terms of lack of expertise, I worry about scientific best practice. This really concerns me in terms of the experimental research paradigms that are being used and our decisions that are interpretations of research that have been made as a result. So with that, I'm going to thank you. I will be honest with you, I've never done a Zoom presentation like that before. Apologies for going over time, and I'll turn it back over to Olav.
Thanks, Ken, for a great talk. What we'll do is go for a couple minutes here past our usual shutdown time, just to see if anyone has any questions. If you'd like to type your questions into the chat box at this time, we'll get Dr. Hector to see if he can give you some great answers.
Hi, one component is I cannot hear you, but I'm assuming that may be Dr. Golson. I'm hoping that you can hear me, Jean. But Dan has asked, do you see cultural issues related to decision making? Oh, that's a very interesting question. One of the studies that we want to run, well, we'll see if we can run it, is taking a look at the use of assessment methods and translating those questions into different languages and seeing what the responses are between those different cultures, if you will, in order to see similarities and or differences along the way. And again, we're talking about accounting for variance as well, and it would be interesting to see if we can model cultural differences in with behavioral as well as the neural data. I hope that answered your question, Dan. Dave asked, have you used these techniques in areas other than medicine? That is that is Olav's bailiwick. I am an applied individual, and I will tell you a story. So the reason why I got into this is I read Olav's paper. Olav did a study looking at blobs and trying to learn different blob shapes. And so when I read the studies, I thought, well, why are we taking a look at blobs? Why not use them in terms of anatomical structures and see how best we can potentially translate the basic sciences into the applied? And so that's other areas that have used neuroimaging, music, sporting performance, Chess. I saw studies associated with acupuncturists. So they have been starting to use and being applied in other disciplines. You will only see, I believe, more so occurring. Any comments on that, Olaf?
No, I think that's a good summary. Does anyone else have any questions at this time? We'll just give everyone a second. I'll just want to thank Dr. Hecker again while we wait for the talk. Thank you so much for zooming in from Calgary. It was good to hear at the outset the weather's improving there. We, of course, in Victoria are having another gorgeous day. And we have some more talk. We got thank you, Lisa. And we got a couple more talks coming in June. I will let John chime in if he's there to remind us of the talks, because I don't actually have my calendar open at this time.
Hey, Olav. Sure, I can just chime in quickly. I guess the first thing I'd say is we've got a great couple of talks scheduled in June. We'll be carrying on in June. I hope that Lila and I will be emailing you all about those in the next couple of days, just to make sure we get the title straight. But it's just to give you a teaser of what we're going to have. It's basically, we're going to have next month's talks are going to be focusing a little bit more on what UVic has been doing in response to COVID-19. And so we're going to have some great local stories coming up next month. The other thing I just want to advertise briefly that hopefully we'll be sending out in an email this week as well is our YouTube channel, the UVic Café Sci YouTube channel. We're actually going to be making all of the talks that you might have seen over the past few weeks available online, and so you can share them with friends or you can watch them again. So yeah, we've got some great updates coming. So we'll hopefully email you about those, as I said, later this week. And I guess, Olav, one thing I was going to initiate you with is our virtual applause. This is something we ask our audience to do. So for those of you who are still with us, please feel free to raise your hand in a virtual applause for our speaker, Kent Hecker, this evening. There we go. It's also a great way of checking that everyone can hear you. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you, Olav and Kent, for giving us a wonderful evening tonight. And with that, we are going to sign off, everyone.